The tech roles in most tech companies are less than 20% female. The troubling thing is that the percentage of women in software, the women in tech, has actually been dropping rather than rising over time. The percentage of women majoring in computer science peaked at 37% in 1984, with a steady decline in the last few decades. This despite the fact that women have had an enormously important role in the history of software. The first computer programmer was a woman. Women designed some of the first computer programming languages. Even the person who coined the term software engineering was a woman. So what happened? In this talk, I'm going to try to provide a few answers, or at least some hints at the answers. But first, let me tell you a little bit about me. Because my journey as a woman in tech and my difficulty in getting to become a software engineer, I think says a lot about why the industry is having a hard time attracting and retaining female engineers. Also, working from the tech industry within the onset, and then becoming an accidental activist of sorts on this issue, has given me some ideas for how we can work together to reverse the trend. So to start, my story. I'm a software engineer at Pinterest now, where I've been for a little bit over 4 years. Some people look at my story and think naturally, clearly, obviously, I would have ended up as a software engineer doing what I do. Both of my parents were software engineers. They both have PhDs in computer science. I grew up in Silicon Valley. My sister and I spent our after-school hours playing in our parents' startup office. I went to high school in Mountain View, which is where Google is located. Then I went to college at Stanford. I even did internships at Google and Facebook. But even then, it wasn't such a straightforward path to software engineering for me. When I was deciding what I wanted to do when I was going to graduate, I was applying to everything. The last time I was in Boston, actually, was when I was visiting PhD programs here, in things like marketing and operations research. I also applied to data analyst positions at various tech companies, which you'll note were technical but not quite technical. Only a couple months before graduation was I convinced to give software engineering a shot, and I signed a job offer to do that. And at that point, my path finally cemented. There's something to be said of the difficulty I had in getting to where I am, despite nearly everything being in my favor. You could even say I was born and bred for this role, and still it was hard. When I started to take computer science classes in high school and college, I was faced with the same gender imbalance that I'm sure all of you know so well. And it was intimidating, particularly with the introductory computer science classes, where so many of my classmates, all men, seemed to already have so much experience coding. Some even had software engineering internships in high school. I felt entirely out of place. I didn't think I'd ever be able to catch up. And after the first few classes, I decided to not major in computer science. I only ended up getting a master's in CS because I was going to get a master's anyways, and a friend dared me to do it in CS. I didn't think I was good enough, but with the dare, I had to do it. I didn't think I would use my technical master's. I figured I might still do something in tech because the culture at Stanford is so tech happy, but I thought I might do something like marketing or strategy or product management maybe, but something on the business side. I wouldn't actually be using my CS degree. My first software engineering internship also came about somewhat unintentionally and accidentally. It was just after I had decided to do the master's program that I was wandering around a career fair, and I came across Facebook's table. They were giving out dog tags with codes for 5 free virtual gifts. And all of you are probably too young to remember, but Facebook used to have a virtual gift shop where you could buy gifts to post on people's walls, something like the stickers that you have now, except they actually cost money back then. It was $1 a pop. And I would actually still buy these stickers and put them on my friends' walls. And so I was very excited about these dog tags because it was basically free money, even though I wasn't excited about the job opportunities at Facebook. But in order to get the free things, I had to give them my resume, so I did. And I remember asking if they had any non-coding positions because I didn't want to do software. And the guy said no, but he took my resume anyways. They followed up about interviews. I figured I might as well do the interviews. Somehow got an offer and then decided might as well take it. I took the offer in part because I was going to do the master's anyways, and I figured it might help to have some more coding experience. But also because I use Facebook every day. Before then, it still hadn't really clicked for me that being a software engineer could mean creating things that I used and that a lot of other people used. And it only started to first make sense at Facebook. But surprisingly, even then, after my internship, I wasn't convinced that I wanted to do software. Upon graduation, it was only because the CEO of Quora, Adam D'Angelo, talked me into being a software engineer. Because at that time, there were only 4 people and desperately needed engineers to build things. And that's how I ended up being a software engineer. I'm grateful that things worked out, and I'm very lucky, but it did take a lot of people along the way, almost forcibly dragging me into it, that I could finally find my passion and realize how cool software is, and how cool it is to be an engineer and to be building things. So that was my path to software engineering. The other thing that sometimes people ask me about is how I became so outspoken on diversity and tech issues. In many ways, it was just as accidental and unintentional. I'd always known that there weren't very many women in engineering, even from very young, because my mom would tell stories about how she was one of only 4 women in her engineering class of 200, how she stood out in the workplace as a woman, and all that. And I had experienced not just that scarcity of women, but also the cultural imbalances in school and when I started working in my internships. But for a long time, I'd never been engaged in the conversation. When I was in school, I wasn't a part of the Society of Women Engineers or Women in CS or anything like that. I can't claim a lifelong passion for feminism or social justice or anything. But in hindsight, of course, I was just slow to realize the value of these organizations and these conversations. I started getting involved in the conversation about being female in engineering, not because I wanted to get involved, but because I was working at Quora then, when we were still a very small company and just starting to build our product and community and trying to bootstrap content. And so all of us early employees had a side job in trying to write as many answers as we could. There weren't a lot of domains in which I felt like I was an expert, but I did feel like I could write about my personal experiences, and nobody could deny those. So I started answering questions about women in CS and women in engineering. Somewhat surprisingly, my writing seemed to really resonate with people. Other women in industry, as well as younger women who were considering or already majoring in computer science. The first major inflection point for me was when I realized the way the world is now is not the way that it has to be, and that the status quo was something to fight against. It was crazy to me that the negative experiences I was having were so pervasive across industry, and that so many other women were frustrated in the same ways that I was. And so I kept up the conversation both internally at Quora and then at Pinterest, where I worked after, and also externally on Quora and Twitter and Medium. The second major inflection point for me was a specific Medium post that I published 2.5 years ago in October of 2013, titled, "Where Are the Numbers?" It was just after the Grace Hopper conference, where I had been at a breakfast with Sheryl Sandberg, and she'd been in front of the room to say something to the effect of how the numbers of women in tech were dropping precipitously. The situation was dire, and we really needed to act. And not that I disagreed with her sentiment, but I wondered what numbers she was talking about, because I had not seen any, despite looking. And I was struck by the irony of the fact that in an industry that is so obsessively data-driven, there was no data at all on diversity, no data at all on what our workplaces look like. And so when I got home to San Francisco, I wrote my Medium post as a sort of call to action for transparency. To be honest, I didn't expect much of a response. But then people started tweeting their stats at me, and I realized that I should set up something to collect the data, which ended up being a GitHub repository. The reason why I did that was because I'm an engineer, but also because it supported the crowdsourced nature of the project, as well as collecting all the metadata around who was submitting the data and when. I wasn't the first person to call for transparency. I wasn't the first person to call for transparency, but I was an insider. I was working in the tech industry, and I had the backing of my employer, Pinterest. And somehow that post and repost sparked an industry-wide movement in releasing the data. In May of 2014, Google became the first major tech company to release a holistic diversity data report, and all the major tech companies followed suit: Facebook, LinkedIn, Yahoo, Apple. And at that point, the conversation around diversity in tech was elevated to a national stage. Even Obama was talking about it in the White House. The numbers made the problem one that people could no longer deny, and that even people outside our industry could see. So, what is the current status of gender diversity in tech? The tech roles in most tech companies, as I mentioned at the top of the talk, are less than 20% female. And this is a generous interpretation of tech. It involves much more than just engineering, also product management and design, and all the other functions supporting product development. Leadership numbers look slightly better because they include tech and non-tech. Note also that there aren't consistent definitions of leadership. So for example, Slack is looking at anyone who is a manager, whereas other companies define it somewhat more stringently. In any case, it's generally not good, somewhere between 15 to 30% of women in leadership. The venture capital industry is even worse. Women comprise less than 6% of investment decision makers at US venture capital firms that have raised at least $100 million in capital since 2009. If we include the smaller firms, it gets up to about 8%, but still, it's not very good. The mystery, though, is not just in why the numbers are so low, but how they got to be so low. Percentage-wise, there were significantly more women in tech a few decades ago, more women in VC as well. The numbers have been dropping. So what happened? NPR did a Planet Money podcast on exactly this topic last year, titled When Women Stopped Coding. It's hard to say definitively what happened, but here's what NPR found. The share of women in computer science started falling at roughly the same moment when personal computers started showing up in US homes in significant numbers. Back then, computers were expensive. Most households wouldn't have more than one. And there were nothing as cool and multi-purpose as they are today. There wasn't much you could do on computers besides some basic word processing, and maybe play some games. Games which were and still are thought to be the domain of boys. Computers then, too, were also thought to be the domain of boys. In some households, the computers would physically be placed in the boys' room, off limits to their sisters. In other cases, the barriers were psychological, sociological, as girls were discouraged from associating too closely with things that were for the boys. Gaming was and has continued to be an important gateway and pathway into computing for many, but mostly for men, who have had that early exposure to computers early on, and also the interest to learn their inner workings. An interesting point on gaming, though, it has become more gendered over time, at least in marketing and in popular perception. Quick history lesson on gaming for all of you. Video games first started to become popular and a cultural phenomenon in the 1970s, what some people call the golden age of video games. Atari released Pong in 1972, and it was immediately a hit. Other popular games included Breakout, Space Invaders, Pac-Man. You may know that none of these are particularly gendered or aggressively masculine, the way later games have become. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The next major moment in video game history was the great video game crash of 1983. Revenues in the US gaming market dropped from $3.2 billion that year to only $100 million 2 years later, a drop of 97%. A number of titles that had been big bets were big flops, and there's rampant overproduction and low quality in the market. Retailer and consumer confidence dropped, and the market collapsed. So as gaming companies strategized how to make their comeback, they looked to marketing. The first major move in the 1980s was to brand games as toys. Their second major move in the early 1990s was to brand games as for boys and young men. And it was a self-reinforcing cycle as market research showed that more boys than girls played video games. Companies doubled down their marketing efforts to boys, and the socialization became even more firmly entrenched. Ironically, there are actually almost equal numbers of female-male gamers today, but the games that women play are dismissed as not real games. In any case, accompanying the masculinization of gaming was the emergence of a particular certain geek mythology, the image of the geek boy genius who is singularly fixated on computers and everything nerdy. And as that has become more and more the image of who codes and who is a software engineer and who studies computer science, girls have felt less and less welcome in the field. Even in the Social Network movie, which came out in 2010, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, and his friends are portrayed as nerdy hacker geniuses bedecked in hoodies. Although, one shift in recent years towards more inclusivity in gaming and in software has been, wait for it, the rise of the programmer. So now you can be a nerdy guy or a bro-y guy, and either way it works. Because of these image issues, one argument that tech companies like to make is that it's a pipeline problem and that there aren't enough people who are studying computer science early on and being in the STEM fields. And it's an issue that's upstream that is unfortunate, but it's not our responsibility to fix. I won't say that there isn't a pipeline problem, and the pipeline problem does need to be addressed, but it's not just a pipeline problem. Women that have indicated express interest and ability in tech and have entered the field are leaving far too quickly. Women leave tech at more than twice the rate that men do. 41% of women will leave within a 10-year period versus only 17% of men. And plus, if there were so many women entering the field in the 80s, it's a bit disingenuous to blame the lack of women in tech leadership on a pipeline problem. What's interesting is that women in tech aren't leaving the workplace at any higher rates than women in other industries. The problem is specifically tech. The biggest reasons that explain women's exit from the industry are dissatisfaction with pay and promotional opportunities. Cut another way, it's a lack of mentorship and sponsorship and a roadmap for progression. Mentorship relationships are more easily same-sex, and it can be difficult for women to navigate the networks of power within their organizations and industry. And then beyond mentorship, there's sponsorship, which is when somebody is not only willing to make time for you and meet you for coffee and give you advice, but they're willing to actually back you and put their name behind you and give you opportunities you might not see otherwise. Relatively speaking, women tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored. It doesn't help that company cultures and the environment overall can be very unfriendly towards women. There's plenty of qualitative research that describes women's stories of suffering through unfriendly and unsupportive work environments. Although, to be fair, some of these issues aren't specific to tech. Women face barriers to advancement across nearly every industry, as can be seen by the low representation of women across all of business and government. Women have to walk a fine line between being too aggressive and too subservient. Women are faced with the likability and competence paradox, where perceptions of their likability and competence are inversely correlated. Women are asked to take on the office housework and are expected to mentor others, even at the cost of doing their own work well. The end result of this is that there are not very many women in tech. Some people wonder why this matters, or if it matters enough for us to care about it. My response is that it's kind of just the right thing to do, to build an industry that's diverse and inclusive of people from all backgrounds, but it's also the smart thing to do. The World Economic Forum points out three distinct arguments for diversity. There's first the diversity case, second the consumer case, and third the talent case. In the context of innovation work, research demonstrates that diverse teams are more creative, more diligent, and most importantly for the business case, drive better financial returns. And it's not just correlation. Controlled experiments show that having diversity on teams actually makes them stronger. Obviously, for firms in industry, it's hard to run these controlled experiments, and it's hard to do that causal analysis, but even there, the correlational data is very compelling. A report released just this month, studying nearly 22,000 publicly traded companies across 91 countries, showed that an increase in the share of women in top management roles from 0 to 30% increased profitability by 15%. There's a pretty clear business case for diversity. For the tech industry, we're building products and services for everyone. The quality, relevance, and impact of these products and services can only be improved by having the people who are building them be demographically representative of the people that are using them. Here's just one example of a case of an oversight that might have been prevented by having some gender diversity on the team. Apple launched HealthKit in iOS 8 as a comprehensive health and fitness tracking portal with everything you can think of tracking: blood alcohol content, inhaler usage, sodium intake, but somehow they missed period tracking. Perhaps one of the most obvious uses of quantified self, but they forgot it. Maybe if they had had more women on the team, they wouldn't have forgotten. There's another angle from which diversity is a very strategic and competitive advantage, and that's hiring. Any of you who've been to a career fair and will know how frenzied the market is, and you've probably been pinged by a ton of different recruiters who are trying to hire you. Everyone is trying to hire software engineers, and there isn't enough supply to meet demand. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that by 2020 there will be 1 million unfilled computer science jobs. The tech industry is severely underutilizing the talent that exists in our economy. it seems to make sense that we should, say, tap more into the female part of the population. So what are companies doing / what should they be doing? The most important thing, I think, is to get the mindset right. First, to view diversity as a strategic advantage, and then to approach diversity in the way that we approach every other business problem that we face. Firstly, in the past and even now, diversity has been treated as a nice-to-have, but not something to prioritize or put resources towards, not a business strategic initiative. This is particularly worrisome as the bubble of the tech sector deflates. If you've been watching the public stock markets, tech companies haven't been doing so hot. Pandora's lost 60% of market cap since last October. LinkedIn lost 40% of its market cap in a single day. Private companies, the unicorns, the companies that are valued over $1 billion plus have been taking pretty massive markdowns. And so even if the bubble isn't bursting, the bubble is definitely deflating. It's easy to see how companies might lose interest in diversity efforts if they're not viewed as must-haves, if they're viewed as nice to have but not mission critical. In past crashes, that's exactly what has happened. It hasn't just been in the last few years that we've talked about diversity. But because business imperatives have always seemed more pressing, particularly in downturns, past diversity efforts have tended to dissipate. The key is for companies to recognize diversity as a top 2 or 3 priority, not just a top 20 priority, because there is a real business case for it. With that kind of prioritization, tech companies should also tackle issues of diversity and inclusion in the way that they do everything else in their business, with rigor and discipline paired with creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. What does that mean concretely? That means, firstly, measuring the data, tracking the data. That means, secondly, setting goals and creating accountability. And that means, thirdly, getting creative with different strategies and tactics, experimenting, and being okay with failing, but then learning and iterating. The work I did originally in writing my Medium post and setting up my GitHub repository spoke to that first step, collecting and understanding the metrics. As an industry, tech has done much better on this front. And even though not all companies are collecting and tracking and reporting their data, many are. We have a reasonably good understanding of our baseline, and we know where we're starting from. An important thing to note about the diversity data disclosures, though, is that between the first wave of disclosures in 2014 to the second annual follow-ups a year later in 2015, very little changed in the way of the numbers. Pretty much every company, including Pinterest, had to sheepishly note that we hadn't done enough. In hindsight, of course, just putting the data out there wasn't going to do anything. Everyone was still mostly doing the same things they'd always been doing, and hoping that numbers would improve wasn't any sort of plan. The tech industry has deep-seated cultural beliefs and major structural issues that weren't going to go away with a little bit of data transparency. So at Pinterest, we realized we needed to commit to change. We realized we needed to set goals and hold ourselves accountable to them. And we decided to drive that accountability by announcing our goals and committing to them publicly, and also committing to periodic updates on our progress towards those goals. We weren't the first to do this. Intel made a big announcement on stage at CES last year, talking about their goals and also pledging $300 million towards that goal. But our embarrassment at seeing our diversity numbers move so little on Pinterest really hit home. And we didn't have a strategy lined up for what we were going to do, but we felt that we needed to at least put the goals out there. We haven't figured it out. We haven't figured it all out, so I don't want everyone to think that I'm up here preaching the way of Pinterest is the right and true, but I do think directionally we are going in the right way. The way that businesses achieve outcomes is by setting goals, whether it's for things like hiring or growth or revenue, and by holding people accountable to those goals. I can report that accountability has helped to galvanize our efforts internally at Pinterest and force us to get a lot more creative and think a lot harder about how we're going to hit those goals. Part of getting creative has meant another mindset shift in how we achieve those goals that we set, being okay with experimenting and failing and actually insisting on experimenting. We don't know how we're going to solve the problems that we have today, and it's foolish to expect that whatever programs we put into place to start will magically fix all of our problems. Just because some of the programs might fail doesn't mean that all diversity and inclusion efforts are doomed to fail. It's important to recognize that. It's also important that we stay disciplined and rigorous throughout all of our efforts, measure as much as we can, and keep learning from there. For example, Pinterest is partnering with the Diversity Strategy Firm Paradigm as part of an effort called Inclusion Labs, where we try out different strategies, different interventions and programs, and study their effectiveness so that we can not only understand for ourselves what happened, but share them with other people. We try to run controlled experiments if we can, as much like academic research, and we measure all of that data. In a recent study we did, we were looking at belonging and inclusion, where we surveyed new hires on how much they felt like they belonged and how much they could succeed in their environment. And we're now trying an intervention to address that belonging uncertainty that women in engineering face. We have a control group and a test group, and we're treating it as real research, where we're working with some researchers at Stanford even to design these interventions. In some cases, it's not possible to run experiments, but even so, we're trying to document as much as we can along the way. The experimental Pinterest apprenticeship program is bringing in people from non-traditional backgrounds, like coding boot camps, and giving them a year of very hands-on mentorship as they apprentice in engineering roles. We don't know yet if this will be a viable way of expanding the talent pool, if the returns will justify the investment, but we'll see. And we'll write up our findings so that others can benefit from our experiments. And that could mean that they're going to adopt similar apprenticeship programs, or maybe that these don't work. It's a little bit cliche for companies to talk about how we're not where we are, we're not where we want to be, and how we're trying all these different ways to fix the problem. And it's especially cliche because there's been so little change. But we are working on it. So some of that may have felt a little bit academic to you, is what companies are doing. Some of you may want to hear more advice that's practical and specific to you. I'm a little bit hesitant to give advice because any advice is always so colored by each person's context and individual experiences. But if you accept that caveat, here's a little bit of advice for women like many of you who are considering or about to enter the tech field. Oh, and I got tired of boring stock photos, so the rest of the slides were all dogs, which I like. So the first thing to remember is why you're in it or why you're about to be, because tech is about building the future, creating the products and services that determine how our world runs and how we interact with it. Software is an amazing tool for creating change and impact, and it will be a major tool for us in solving some of the major problems in society. Going forward, every sector will be touched by software. It's not just the tech industry. Everything from healthcare and education to filmmaking and fashion. If they haven't been changed already, they will be in a big way. Being in tech is a good way to stay relevant and to be a part of the future. And even as a means to an end, it's fun to write code and build software. It's both art and science. It requires precision and logic, but also creativity. And it's collaborative. You get to work with a lot of different people and stretch your brain in different ways. Some of you may hear this and think, yes, that's all fine and true, but I'm not good enough. And I want to reaffirm for you that you are good enough and that you're better than you think you are. Women are likely to be afflicted by imposter syndrome, that inability to internalize success and belonging, and that persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. And more than that, we get that reinforcement from our environment as well. A study that just came out recently, a week ago in fact, found that when asked who the best students in their classes were, men tended to nominate other men, even when the women were getting higher grades. Men have been socialized their entire lives to have this bias. And I mentioned this earlier too. I felt it when I was taking introductory computer science classes at Stanford. I was intimidated by my male peers. I felt like they were very impressive and far ahead of me. What's interesting is that for me, for that one weeder class that finally weeded me out, the class after which I decided to not major in computer science, the quarter afterwards, the professor asked me to TA for him the next time that class was offered. I pushed back on him and asked if maybe he had confused me for somebody else. I have a somewhat generic Asian name. Maybe he had an off by one error in his spreadsheet. And we went back and forth a number of times where he insisted that he was thinking of me and he thought that I would do a good job and that even if I didn't, it was okay and it was his responsibility as a professor. And so I was convinced to try TAing. And when I did take on that TA position and I was on the other side of the table, I had the revelation that maybe I wasn't so bad at CS after all. In grading assignments and in hosting office hours, I saw that not everybody was a CS genius, and the men talked themselves up a lot more than I had imagined. In being a TA, I was finally able to calibrate a little bit, and I realized if I had to be as objective as I could be, I probably would have placed myself in the top 10th percentile, even though the whole time I've been taking the class, I felt like I was in the bottom 10th. And my experience is not that unique, I think. Please remember that you are good enough. And plus, there are plenty of men that aren't that great at CS or are doing it anyways. So don't let an unreasonable disbelief in your abilities stop you. Past that, though, I know it's still very easy to be discouraged. Sometimes people around you question you or hold you back or make you feel like you don't belong. And it's even worse if you're not even sure that it's happening and maybe it's just you and you're imagining things. And try to remember, it's probably not just you. And in fact, it might not be you at all. It makes me a little bit sad that this still happens because I went through all of this when I started working too. I even had a manager ask me once, have you considered your baseline level of happiness? You might just be an unhappy person. And maybe there isn't sexism, but you're just projecting it around you. Years later, I'm still getting new grads that come up to me to say, I might just be oversensitive and this might just be in my head, but I feel like people don't treat me that well as a software engineer. And they all start that way. I might just be oversensitive. I might just be making it up. It's easy to internalize these problems and to blame yourself, but it's not you. It's a system that's broken. So don't take it out on yourself. One thing that really helps is having a solid support network, people who can validate your experience, share theirs, and be there for you. When I first started working, I didn't have this. It was overwhelmingly lonely. And even after the first female engineer besides me to join Quora, it took a while before we were close enough to have heart-to-hearts. But everything got so much better after that. Sometimes you just need somebody to listen to you as you're crying in the bathroom or wherever you've managed to hide yourself away. And even if there aren't other women in your workplace, there are others in the industry. Percentage-wise, we don't make up enough of the industry, but in numbers, we're definitely still here. And so reach out, and there's a good chance that you'll find really amazing people to add to your network who can support you. I hope you're not getting the message that being a woman in tech is being doomed to a life of sadness. Well, you'll necessarily be mistreated and need a support network to get through it all. There are good places to work, or at least good teams to be on, and there are leaders that are supportive of diversity and trying to build inclusive environments. It can be hard before you've started working somewhere to know whether it's good or not. But it is something to be mindful of and try to assess when you're interviewing, as much as you can. And if you do end up somewhere that isn't good, there are places that are good. And don't feel bad about having some self-respect, picking up, and moving on. It's like getting out of a bad relationship. You have to believe in yourself and your ability to find something better, and you can be happy and fulfilled. With this kind of a crowd, I know that a lot of you will hear these things and want to help make the situation better. You'll want to make the cause your own. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the specifics of what you can do, whether that's attending events or getting involved with mentorship or volunteering. I don't want to be prescriptive in that way. But I'll try to give you some guidance on how to think about this kind of work to support diversity and how to incorporate it in your career. First, I want to point out that diversity work is a second shift on top of the normal things that you do that are your primary function, whether that's your schoolwork or your job once you start working. So it's important to make sure that you're getting everything you need to get done first, and also that you're taking care of yourself first before trying to pick up the extra work. And you'll be more effective as an advocate if you're excelling in your normal job. It's not totally fair, but I found that I've needed to hold myself up to a higher standard, to outperform expectations, to be totally unassailable in my engineering work. So no one would be able to say that I was just going on about diversity because I wasn't good enough and couldn't cut it and needed a handicap. But because I've been able to put that focus on my engineering career too, I've also been able to serve as an example to peers of a female engineer who can be good at her job. So that's not to say that you shouldn't get involved, because obviously this movement needs people to get involved. But I also want you to be a little bit selfish, to focus on yourself first, and be awesome in your career. And in some cases, that may be the best way you can contribute. When you do get involved, be strategic. There are some types of work you can do that will be more leveraged and/or more advantageous to your career. For example, speaking opportunities reach a wider audience than you might get otherwise, and they also help you to develop your presentation skills and build a brand. Or if you're working with employee resource groups or community groups, taking on leadership roles can help you to grow in skill sets beyond engineering. Just be careful not to saddle yourself with a lot of grunt work like note-taking or logistics work like booking event space or ordering food, that sort of thing. And those things do need to get done, of course, and we all have to chip in and do the unglamorous work sometimes, but be mindful that you're not just doing that kind of work. In an everyday school or workplace setting, you can help by supporting the women around you. There is some research to show that women are sometimes even harder on other women than the men are. I don't know all the reasons why. It could be that we especially want to make sure we're not lowering the standard, that mythical bar that everyone keeps accusing us of lowering. But in social patterns too, we perpetuate some of the same bad behaviors, like interrupting each other. Men interrupt the most, and they mostly interrupt women, but women interrupt as well, and we also tend to interrupt women. It might just be that women are more interruptible. But in any case, we're stronger as a community if we can support each other and look out for each other. And this is especially the case because women are frowned upon when we stand up for ourselves or self-promote, and are instead supposed to be communal and supportive of others, even though these behaviors that are expected of us work against us in our advancement in the workplace. So the way to win is for us to support each other. There's a lot more to say, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up quickly and open for questions. Sometimes people ask me where I see the industry in 5 years or in 10 years. And I think it is very possible that nothing changes, because not much has changed in the last few decades. But it's also the case that we can try to bring about the future that we want. And I think there is reason for optimism. We're doing quite well, at least on the awareness part of the issue. And people are always talking about diversity now. And obviously, there's a lot more that comes after that. We need to deeply understand the issues, and we need to commit to solving them. But there is a lot of momentum right now, and I think we can capitalize on it to drive some lasting change. And hopefully, in 10 years, we won't be having this conversation anymore. Thank you.
Hi, so I've kind of been sitting here this whole time squirming in my seat a little, because we just had a talk about diversity, where we were then told to not be super active in the cause because we should be selfish to ourselves. We're all in this room right now because we're a group of privileged women. Whether we want to say it or not, we might have had struggles to get here, struggles to get in the universities we are, but we are all already women in tech. I find it strange that we just had a talk about diversity where we didn't talk once about race, where we didn't talk once about poverty. And there are so many barriers, both sexism-related, poverty-related, and racial-related to getting into the tech industry. If you grow up in an impoverished community in America, you are less likely to have computer science education at all. And in most schools, even privileged schools, we don't even have that education. It is fully a pipeline problem, and I don't know how we all just sat here and had this conversation without even tackling those problems. The reason there's no change is because in rooms like this, full of privileged women, we aren't talking about these problems. We aren't talking about how we can get involved on the grassroots and how we can dig in the trenches and actually lift up communities. We aren't going to have diversity that we can just take if that diversity is not there. We need to foster it. There's systematic racism, sexism, and poverty gaps in America. And in tech, that's entrenched. If you don't have a computer, if you don't have internet, if you're being torn down for race or your gender, these are all things that mean you can't get involved. So I don't know. What's your opinion on these things? Why didn't you touch on that at all?
That was a good talk. So first of all, I totally agree that there are many facets to the issue. For this talk, if you'll notice, at the very beginning of the title slide, I put an asterisk next to diversity to indicate that it was just gender diversity, even though a snappier title is just tech diversity. There's a lot more to discuss. Sometimes you just have to focus on one issue. But the issues of intersectionality are really important to me as well. The issues of race, which is very intertwined with class, obviously very significant. And I do think people should get involved. Where I'm coming from in terms of saying that sometimes you need to be selfish is that I've seen a lot of people who struggle just to make it themselves. And sometimes it's difficult to expect them to be giving back when they're just trying to make it. And I've also seen people who aren't even succeeding in their own jobs and are taking away time. And it's gone to the point where sometimes like they can't even be performing in their jobs and they're being close to being let go. And to expect them to have to give back seems a little bit unfair.
I'm so sorry, but that's such a smaller issue than the larger issue in general. Like, there are so few women actually involved in the cause, and I've maybe met 1 or 2 people who give too much. And if we had everyone give just a minimal level of effort, this would be so much of a stronger goal, because like for every person who is struggling a little themselves as a woman in the industry, there are hundreds and thousands of young women and young people of color who are struggling to even just get the education they need in this country, and who are struggling to make it and get into college and have the money to pay for college. I know personally I'm a first-generation college student. I go to a small county school, but I still consider myself so much more privileged than the average student growing up in this country today. And I know a lot of people in this room have had parents as software engineers who are going to Ivy League schools or just even good schools in general. I think my school's pretty okay. Like, I don't think that we should even be talking about taking a step back from a cause where there's not enough activism.
There are lots of issues that exist in the world. It's very difficult to expect that everyone have to be involved with all of them. And I just think it's really important that people be able to take care of themselves first. And it's something that is a difficult subject for me as well, because I have dedicated so much of my life towards a cause. And so if you're talking about people getting involved, like I'm probably not necessarily the right person to be criticizing. But I've also seen the case where people are just struggling themselves to get through. And I recognize that we have a lot of privilege, even just to be here.
I guess I'm just talking a bit to a quiet crowd and a bit of an impasse, so I think I'm just going to sit down, but I did my best.
Thank you.
Hi. My question is just, how do you balance working in the tech field and a personal life? Like, do you find it difficult to balance compared to being in another field?
So I've only worked in tech, so it's hard for me to say without, I'm just kind of projecting what happens in other industries. I think it varies a lot based on where you're working. There have been places I've worked that were very much like that stereotypical work all day, all night sort of lifestyle. And there are some places that have a pretty good 9-to-5 sort of work day. And in theory, like, software engineering is very flexible. You can work from anywhere. So there are companies that are very supportive of people working remotely in a distributed fashion when they want to. Other places that have stronger demands on you being in the office. But it really just depends on the workplace. I think as a whole, there's probably more flexibility than there is in other industries.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm a part of a computer science club on my campus, and I was wondering if you had like any concrete steps that we could take to encourage more women to like switch to computer science, or like help the women who've already like just started to get over like the initial hurdle, just ways we could help out as college students.
Yeah. So there's actually a pretty cool piece that Maria Clave from Harvey Mudd just published on how they got their computer science class to be up to 45% women over the last few years. And some of the things that have helped in getting more women interested were showing the practical applications of computer science and showing what sort of impact they could have with CS. And so some of that is just in the design of assignments, or showing people the cool things that they can build that are more than just manipulating memory or some of that super low-level stuff, but really drawing that connection between the work and the impact. In terms of supporting people, just like helping them to understand that they're not alone and that it's okay to start a little bit late and can still get caught up. And so those communities have been really helpful too. I think at Stanford they have a pretty active Women in CS group where they have casual dinners. And all those sorts of things are really helpful in forming the community.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So you mentioned something really interesting, which was that sometimes women can get nervous, I guess, that they're kind of failing and reaching this invisible barrier, like they're bringing down the computer science world, I guess. So what's your advice for someone who feels like, I don't know, like they shouldn't fail at it, their code should be perfect every time? Like, how do you, I guess that's my question.
I think it's a question that people not just in CS face, like being very perfection-minded, especially people in prestigious universities and in environments that kind of highlight that perfection. So I think some of it's just like getting comfortable with not being perfect all the time. But then the other part of it for CS and the fields in which you are a minority is understanding that you don't have to uphold the whole weight of the minority. And it is something difficult. Like there's a pretty funny XKCD comic, funny but sad, where there's a picture of a guy who's on the whiteboard and he gets something wrong. And when he gets it wrong, somebody's like, oh, John's bad at math. And then the picture where the girl gets it wrong, they're like, oh, girls are bad at math. And that sort of thing happens. But you shouldn't have to feel that whole weight of the minority, and people say that sort of thing to you, call them out on it, and try to just get past it. I know imposter syndrome is something that's really difficult to get past, and some of it just requires people telling you over and over that you're going to be okay, and as you accumulate more experiences underneath your belt, you've taken more classes, done well in different things, have accumulated different internship experiences or whatever it is, like over time it'll wear away a little bit. But I don't think there's any one solution because it is a pretty deep-seated psychological thing.
Hi. So a lot of times when speakers come up and talk, they usually talk about their accomplishments. So I'm wondering if you could give us an example of something that happened to you where you failed at and was able to get back up in. Because I know you were an engineer at Google and a lot of other great companies. So was there a time also that you were struggling to try to get to another place as well?
Yeah, sometimes people will look at my internships and feel like it was like so easy for me. I actually got rejected from almost everything early on. When I got my Google offer, it was like, oh my God, I finally managed to like trick somebody into giving me an offer. And I even think that like maybe my Google offer wasn't real because I think they screwed up my interviewers. So I'm not totally sure I deserve to get that, but I did. I got rejected from Microsoft like 3 times, just like over and over again. I just kept getting rejected. When I was interviewing for full-time roles, I got rejected over and over. And it was, in some cases, like the only thing I had. I came in last minute and I managed to take it. I think a lot of the difficulties I had though were actually probably more psychological and not dealing with these very well. So I felt like I was gonna fail out all through college. Like every quarter after finals, I would go to my friends and tell them, like, I don't know if I'll be here, I might have failed out. And when I first started working, it was really difficult, like dealing with all the sexism and the way people would treat me. And I almost quit tech because I just didn't feel like I was good enough. I didn't think I was gonna cut it. And so that was probably more like the failure mode.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. So I feel like I think we all come together to think that yes, we should be advocates of feminism and women empowerment for gender equality and diversity in tech. I was wondering if you think that's also the time for us to be advocates of other activist issues, advocates for racial justice, advocates for social justice. You know, as feminists, is there also a responsibility for us to start talking about other minorities, not only gender minorities, specifically in the tech industry?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think it's really important that we think about how we can bridge with other communities. And if you look at the history of these different movements, they've only been able to succeed with allies. And it's important to get more people on board. So if you look at the LGBT movement, it was really important for them to have gotten allies on board. I think it's important for us to ally with other initiatives and other activism. So we talk about gender diversity a lot in tech, and some of that is just because gender is the most obvious thing to look at first. When you're not 50-50 female-male, it's like pretty obvious that there's a problem. With things like race, it can be a little bit more difficult because it's harder to know where we should be. Are we trying to match the demographics of the city, the state, the country, the world? It's very unclear. But I do think it's very important that we consider all these adjacent movements, and there's intersectionality. So within tech, we talk about gender diversity, but there's also the intersectionality with race. And the experience that white women have is very different than the experience that Asian women, Black women, and Latino women have. And I've tried to start speaking a little bit more on the race issues. It is a little bit unusual coming from the Asian community, where we're actually overrepresented in tech. I think there are some reports that Asians are now more than 50% of tech in Silicon Valley, whereas we're only 5% of the United States overall. So it's this interesting experience of being in the majority and overrepresented, even though we are a minority in other contexts. But I think it's important that Asians in particular get involved in these conversations around Black Lives Matter. The idea of the model minority was carved out as a tool of anti-Black racism in the 1960s. And the reason why that happened was because they wanted to set apart these different communities of color. And so if Asians as a community of color can succeed because we've worked hard and have a good ethic, then the reason why the other communities aren't succeeding is because they don't work hard, right? That's the sort of story that the basically Black racists were trying to tell. I think it's really important that as Asians we are looking at that. And obviously all these different things are intertwined. We're looking at social justice, socioeconomic justice. These things have pretty major implications for racial diversity in tech as well. So everything is kind of tangled together. It's hard to pick up a clean narrative and say exactly what we should do. But yeah, absolutely, I think it's really important that we are good allies to other movements.
Thank you so much.
What do we do to retain the diversity that we've created in tech? Are there initiatives that Pinterest or other companies have come up with to keep women and minorities in their companies that you think are particularly impressive?
It's a hard question to answer in terms of specific initiatives because I think all this work around inclusivity is actually just a question of culture. And so it's a question of our companies building workplaces that people from different backgrounds can succeed in. So it's not individual things that people talk about for culture. If you're talking about Google is very famous for its culture, but it's not just that they have fancy food or just that they have these massage chairs. It's the whole sort of environment that you're building. And so it is important now that companies are looking at how to build inclusive cultures and measuring to understand if there are differences in retention. And so Google relatively famously has lots of people analytics to understand whether people are staying or not and trying to make adjustments if they see any sort of anomalies in that data.
Thank you.
But yeah, sorry, I don't have specifics. Okay, just one more question.
Hi, so I know that you were considering going to business school and then instead got a master's in computer science. And I personally majored in computer science, and my role right now is non-technical. And I think I want to stay in that, and talking to a lot of other women who are computer science undergrads say, I'm kind of intrigued by non-technical positions. I think I want to go into product management instead of being a software engineer. And one of the biggest reasons that people say that is because they want to make more of a social impact. Mm-hmm. So it's like you can either build something amazing or you can kind of start a company or be the CEO or something like that. How did you make that decision that I will keep going against whatever obstacles I'm facing and whatever insecurities I have with my own computer science skills to become successful in the software engineering track instead of saying I can make that kind of impact as a business person?
Yeah, I think some of it was just understanding that having software skills would be helpful in any of those other paths I might want to take down the line. And there's a pretty big difference between majoring in computer science and actually working as a software engineer. And I just wanted to have some of that in the field experience. And I figured having a few years of being a software engineer would help me be a better founder if I wanted to do that, or be a better product manager if I was actually going to be working with engineers. But the other thing I realized once I started working as an engineer was that engineers actually do have a lot of that impact. It's just hard. Sometimes we get called code monkeys, and that takes away from the sort of impact that engineers do have in driving product vision and determining how things are going to be shaped and built. So I realized as a software engineer that I could help to create these different products and really set the direction much more so sometimes than even the product managers I was working with. So being the one who's on the ground and building, where you're architecting and thinking about how you want to make something sustainable and maintainable, is actually really powerful. So that was something I didn't realize, but I came across a little bit later. But yeah, the thrust of it was that being a software engineer first would be helpful for anything else down the line. So it felt like a very safe choice in the beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you.